Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host in India. From the ruins of American hegemony to the rise of the multipolar world, today we sit down with one of the most incisive political economists of our time to make sense of the force reshaping our global order. Joining us on Business Talk today, a scholar whose work has redefined how we understand global power. We are truly honored to welcome Dr. Radhika Desai. Before we begin, allow me to introduce the remarkable mind joining us on the show today. Dr. Radhika Desai is a professor in the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, Canada. She is also the convener of the International Manifesto Group and a past president of the Society for Social Studies. At the heart of Dr. Desai's scholarship lies geopolitical economy, a bold analytical framework she introduced in her landmark 2013 work, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. The approach grounds the study of international relations in Marx's theory of contradictory capitalist production, foregrounds the centrality of state economic agency, and offers an original reading of uneven and combined development as the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism. Dr. Desai's impressive body of work includes Slouching Towards Ayodhya, From Congress to Hindutva in Indian Politics and Intellectuals and Socialism, the latter earning recognition as a new statement and society book of the month. She is currently working on Hindutva and the political economy of Indian capitalism and Marx as a monetary theorist. With Dr. Alan Freeman, she co-edits two major book series, the Geopolitical Economy series with Manchester University Press and the Future of Capitalism series with Pluto Press. A sought-after commentator and journalist, her work regularly features in major national and international media outlets. She also hosts the widely followed YouTube show Geopolitical Economy Hour, where she brings scholarly rigor to conversations on global political economy, multipolarity, and the future of capitalism. Dr. Desai holds a PhD in political studies from Queen's University, Kingston, Canada, and a BA with honors in political science from MS University, Baroda, India. In today's episode, Dr. Radhika Desai joins us to explore the core ideas from her acclaimed book, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Radhika Desai to the conversation. Professor Radhika, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It's a truly an honor and privilege to welcome you on Business Talk.
Well, I'm also delighted and honored to accept your invitation. Thank you, Deepak.
Thank you. Professor, the title itself is a provocation. After US hegemony, where you wrote this book in 2013, were you making a prediction about the future or diagnosis something that had already happened? And how do you feel about that diagnosis today?
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting question. So I originally began writing this book when I was supposed to be a critique of globalization, but it was the theory of globalization because I had always been skeptical of the idea that that we are living in a globalized world and national economies and national borders have become irrelevant and the whole world economy is a seamless whole. I thought this is rubbish. But at the same time, I kind of thought that, or rather, let me rephrase that. When I started writing this book, I was going to use the idea of US hegemony in order to criticize the idea of globalization. So I was going to say that, globalization is not a real social theory. It does not explain to us what the world is like. It is an ideology generated by the US state to essentially articulate one phase in its management of its own hegemonic decline. So, if you use the expression hegemonic decline, then you clearly accept that the United States was once hegemonic. But then, as I started to try to operationalize this argument, I found that the idea of US hegemony was extremely frustrating to deal with. There seemed to be more definitions of US hegemony than there were writers on US hegemony, and each individual writer would have more than one, often, definition. And so I realized that actually the idea of US hegemony is also very problematic. So I then found myself essentially writing a book that was a critique of all cosmopolitan ideas of the world economy. And by cosmopolitan, this is an expression used by Friedrich List, mid-19th century German writer on the developmental state, on industrial policy, and such like things. He was very much against the ideology of free trade. So he says, he criticizes these cosmopolitan theories, which assume that the whole world economy is a single world economy whose division into nation states is completely superficial, meaningless, etc., etc. And so I often used to introduce this book by saying that, cosmopolitan views. So there are cosmopolitan views like globalization and free trade, which assume that the world economy is unified by markets. And then there's the discourse of US hegemony and empire, which says that the world economy is still seamlessly unified, but it is unified by a leading state. And my argument is both of these discourses are wrong. And what's more, the Marxist framework that I created in order to make this argument, and there's also a lot that I discovered in doing that, because I discovered, for example, that Marx doesn't just talk about class. He talks about class and nation together in the same frame. They are both important historical actors. But anyway, in the course of doing this, in the framework that I created, I also was able to show that essentially these cosmopolitan ideologies of the world economy are ideologies of imperialism, because a seamless world economy is what imperialism wants, so that the corporations of big imperial powers can roam all over the world and do whatever they like, as if there were no national borders, there were no national governments to respect, etc., etc. So this is their dream world. But of course, thankfully, it is not a reality. And so the other thing geopolitical economy ended up doing was placing imperialism at the core of its understanding, and the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism, what Trotsky also called uneven and combined development. This dialectic is the motor that drives international relations forward. That is the motor of what developments will take place is determined by this. And so finally, let me make one further point, and that is that in the unfolding of uneven and combined development over the entire history of capitalism, it is not the story that is told is not that of ever expanding markets, or or a succession of hegemonies. You had the Italian city-states, and then the Dutch, and then the British, and then the Americans. None of this. What you actually see is that the unfolding of uneven and combined development of imperialism and anti-imperialism has led to a multipolar world. And I would argue also that today, and I developed this more in my other book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, that this multipolar world is the pathway to socialism, generally speaking. So I hope that gives you a good answer for your question.
You coined the term geopolitical economy to replace the dominant frameworks of international political economy. What was so fundamentally broken about the existing theories of US hegemony and globalization that you felt an entirely new intellectual framework was needed?
Yeah, this is another very important question. So, I mean, basically, geopolitical economy is a critique of the existing theories of international political economy, although I would say they also apply to the larger field of international relations. My critique of the reason why they are not fit is because they are, number one, they were unable to explain or anticipate multipolarity. I mean, it has left them completely, without being, with no theoretical leg to stand on, essentially. And when you have a theory like that, it clearly needs replacing. But secondly, also, like they are both, all the two major approaches in international relations and international political economy, which are liberalism and realism. I would say that they are both problematic. So liberalism is essentially this idea of a single world economy and so on. So both the cosmopolitan approaches, US hegemony, globalization, belong to some version of liberalism. Liberalism is simply wrong because it completely fails to anticipate the simple fact that free markets, free trade, this kind of liberal single is simply an ideology of imperialism outright, and that all the development in the world that has taken place by opposing liberal tenets, liberal free market and free trade tenets, not by conforming to them. The countries that conform to them consign themselves to lifelong subordination to other countries. So that's the liberal approaches. The realist approaches are also very interesting. You'd think that, given that I emphasize the importance of nation states and national economies, that I would be somehow a realist, but I also reject realism for the simple reason that realism simply assumes that states will act in the same way no matter when, no matter where, no matter which state you are talking about. Basically the idea is that each state will be as aggressive as it is capable of being. It will project its national interests and so on, and therefore conflict is inevitable, etc., etc. This is also complete rubbish, and it is a way of justifying American aggression in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I would say that, and by the way, I should say as a side note that if people always say that E.H. Carr, the Edward Hallett Carr, was the father of realism, if you actually read his 20 Years Crisis, which is regarded as this locus classicus of his liberal, it is far closer to geopolitical economy than to what is touted as realism. But I'll leave that just as a comment for those who are listeners who may be familiar with E.H. Carr's work. But let me just continue. So essentially, realism is a way of justifying American aggression. And it is not adequate, therefore, as a theory. In fact, my friend Kees van der Pijl, in his own way, like my critique is a critique of IPE, International Political Economy. Kees van der Pijl wrote a critique of international relations, and the third book in the trilogy is entitled The Discipline of Western Supremacy. So both IPE and our international IR are disciplines of Western supremacy. We need to replace them. And it's also not uninteresting that the major theorists of both of these disciplines are Americans.
Professor, you argue that theories of US hegemony are not neutral academic constructs. They are ideological instruments tied to successive failed US attempts at world dominance through the dollar. Can you walk us through the stages of the dollar strategy and where each one fell short?
Right. So this is a very, again, you take a very important aspect of the book Geopolitical Economy, because a large part of it is concerned with the dollar system. And the reason is very simple. The critique of the idea of US hegemony and then also globalization as a phase in the American attempt to achieve it. So overall, my argument in geopolitical economy is this, I often introduce it in the following way. You may have heard many people argue that that the United States is hegemonic. You may have heard other people argue that the United States was once hegemonic but is now declining. But I bet you've never heard anybody argue that the United States was never hegemonic. And that is the argument of the book. And much of this argument is made by telling a certain story about the dollar system. And the reason for placing the dollar system so centrally in the account of American hegemony and its American hegemony in heavy quotation mark and its career is that that was the choice of American policymakers. It is not by dint of this or that scholar or this or that scholarly definition of US hegemony, but actually the real project of hegemony as American leaders and ruling elites have attempted to achieve it. So my argument is that very early in the 20th century, the United States could see that British power was waning. And the United States had already emerged as the world's biggest industrial power, and and biggest trading nation, and so on. So these people said, okay, so if the British power is waning, we are going to be the successor. Just as Britain was so critical to the overall world economy, it dominated the world economy. We are going to dominate the world economy. However, there was a big sort of fly in the ointment, shall we say. And the fly in the ointment was that the world had already become quite multipolar. When Germany, Japan, and the United States developed behind protectionist wars through a strategy of state-directed development, when they developed, they already had made the world multipolar. It was now going to be very difficult for any country to dominate the world economy, which in the way that briefly in the middle a third of the 19th century, Britain had been able to do, with its power already beginning to decline with the industrialization of these other powers by the late 19th century. So the world was already multipolar. Plus, the United States could see that it could never acquire an empire of the size of the British Empire. It would be too costly in terms of blood and treasure, etc., etc. So this was not on the cards. The world, moreover, was already divided up among the major industrial powers. The United States was a kind of Johnny-come-lately to the imperial game because it was for so long preoccupied in the project of internal colonialism, that is the expansion of the United States from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific. And so this process took a lot of time. And so by the time in the 1890s that it was completed, the world was close to divided up. The US could not have very many colonies. So they said, okay, we're not going to try to acquire colonies, but what we are going to do is we are going to make the dollar the world's money in the same sense as sterling is the world's money at that time. So this was the idea. Now there is there's also a flaw, a sort of fly in this ointment, because sterling was only able to be the world's money because Britain, in a relatively stable fashion, it was never completely stable, but Britain was able to extract vast surpluses from its colonies, particularly British India, which of course was the biggest of them all. And at that time, people will remember that it included Pakistan, Bangladesh, and for a time even Burma. So it was a huge territory and very lucrative, very productive. So the British extracted huge surpluses from there, which they then exported as capital exports. And these capital exports, by the way, went from what we can call the non-settler colonies of the UK, like British India or Africa or the Caribbean, to its settler colonies and to Europe and to the United States. So it went to continental Europe, it went to the United States, and it went to Britain's remaining settler colonies such as Canada, Australia, South Africa, etc. So, and there is no surprise, therefore, that this was the period of the fastest industrialization of these parts of the world. So there was a racial angle to this because, you know, the countries of Asia, Africa, South Asia, Africa, Latin, the Caribbean paid for the industrialization of these countries. But this could be done. But the United States had no colonies, no surpluses to export. And it was always from the beginning essentially supplying the world with liquidity by running deficits. And this, as the famous Belgian economist Robert Triffin pointed out, was subject to the Triffin dilemma. The bigger the deficits, the more the downward pressure on the dollar. Now, these deficits were already causing problems, and in any case, so basically the US forced the dollar on the world because by the simple expedient of rejecting alternative proposals. John Maynard Keynes had gone to Bretton Woods with some wonderful proposals for how to replace the sterling system. The sterling system was no longer working, so it would be replaced with an international, multilaterally agreed currency, which he said, let's call it Bancor, which would be run by a multilaterally created international clearing union, And there are many good things about it, which I won't go into right now, but that would have been a good arrangement. And as we talk more and more about de-dollarization in our time, we should look at what Keynes proposed and why he proposed it in this way. But I'll leave that aside. So the US simply nixed this and said, the world must, we can't have these artificially contrived systems. So the world was left with no alternative but to accept the dollar. And the US sort of sweetened this bitter pill by saying verbally, just making a verbal promise that we will exchange the dollar at the current rate of $35 an ounce in perpetuity. But this arrangement never worked well. So my argument in geopolitical economy is that the dollar has never served the world well as its currency. So in the 1950s, for most of the 50s, the European countries were devastated. So much of the world was devastated by war. They were going through reconstruction. They needed to import a lot of things from the United States. But given that the United States was already running a huge export surplus, but no capital exports, just goods surplus, the world owed the Americans money, so they had to pay them dollars. There was no way they could earn enough dollars, so there was actually a shortage of dollars. But after 1958, when the European countries became, they had recovered, they made their currencies convertible, they started using their own currencies in their mutual trade and so on. And they no longer wanted dollars. And they said to the Americans, please give us gold instead, because you have made the dollar convertible into gold. We'll take the gold, you keep your devalued dollars for yourselves. And by the way, the dollars were devalued by this time because the United States was also engaged in wars. So they were essentially paying for the war by printing dollars, and this was not acceptable. So already by 1961, the United States no longer had enough gold to back dollars with. So from 61 to 71, you have a decade during which the United States tries every expedient possible, every recourse possible to somehow try to keep the arrangement going, that the dollar is still the world's money, we are going to back it with gold, but it did not work. And in the end, in 1971, Nixon had to throw in the towel and say, okay, we are no longer going to make the dollar convertible into gold. Now, this was a major turning point. Now, a lot of people say today, in retrospect, oh, look, this did not affect the dollar at all badly. The dollar remains the world's currency. You see how amazing this is, etc. There is an entire industry devoted to talking up the dollar system. But if you look, if you open the hood and look underneath at the engine of the dollar system, you will see a very ugly reality. The dollar after 1971 has only been able to remain the world's money by essentially through a series of sort of, attempts to have hit upon a extremely dangerous, volatile, destabilizing a solution. So, after the 1970s and everything that happened there, and things did not go well for the dollar, even after the Americans convinced the OPEC countries to price oil in dollars and everything, the dollar still continued sinking to the point where circa 1980, it hit $800 an ounce, from $35 to $800. So you can see the devaluation of the dollar that took place in this time, in this very short time. Of course, then, and of course, the other thing you should know is that in real terms, that devaluation was only surpassed very recently in the last few years, couple of years, when in real terms, the devaluation is what $800 meant in 1980 or so. Of course, after that, it took the Volcker shock to jack up interest rates so high that the Americans were paying through their nose for what borrowing they were doing from the rest of the world. The borrowing costs were very high and so on. And so by the 1990s, in fact, the euro was beginning to be planned, and people even thought that this is the end for the dollar. But this is when they hit upon a new thing, which is essentially the Clinton administration went for a big drive to expand, to get countries to lift capital controls. Because the idea was that if you essentially create a lot of financial activity, if you expand financial activity in dollar-denominated financial activity, then money will pour into the dollar system, and that will put an updraft under the dollar. It will secure the value of the dollar from the downward pressure that American deficits created by all this dollar printing was creating. So yeah, so they did that. So essentially, the dollar is today the world's currency because of a series of financial bubbles. You had the dot-com bubble, you had the housing and credit bubbles. Now you have the everything bubble. And of course, with each new phase, the US authorities, the Federal Reserve has had to think of more and more ingenious ways to try to support it. But I would say that when the next big crash comes, which is imminent, some people say it could happen this year, then the dollar system will be in a shambles. It will no longer be able to survive.
Professor, hegemonic stability theory has long been treated as a serious academic framework. You call it a form of retrospective self-justification. What do you mean by that, and why does it matter who tells the story?
Yeah, that's okay. In this book, I say that the HST, hegemony stability theory, is both retrospective and prospective. So what I find really interesting is that HST only emerges in the early 1970s. And in the book in which this theory was proposed by Charles Kindleberger, it was a book entitled The World in Depression. Charles Kindleberger argues that in the post-Second World War period up to the early 1970s, the US had been hegemonic. Now, the purpose of this is twofold. And, why write a book about the Great Depression? So the the 1970s were another period of crisis similar in some ways to what happened in the 1930s. So Kindleberger is talking about the Great Depression, and it's really, you can see it's not a social scientific theory to be taken seriously, because he says it is an explanation of the Great Depression. Now, I find this very funny, because he's not saying it's the explanation. Now, quite frankly, either something is the explanation or it's not an explanation. It cannot be an explanation. But this is the sleight of hand that Kindleberger indulged in. And his argument was, and he says that the reason the Great Depression occurred is because the United Kingdom, Britain, had ceased to be able to be the dominant power and able to sort of, organize the expansion of world capitalism and so on. And the US was not yet willing. So between this no longer able and the not yet willing was a gap in time during which the mechanism of the world economy broke down, and there was mayhem and chaos, etc., etc. So by implication, the argument was that the world needs a hegemon. And making this argument in the 1970s, he was retrospectively casting what the US had done in the post-Second World War period as something that the US had done as a hegemonic power. Now this hegemony was in decline, and that's why we had the crisis of the 1970s. And in the future, either American power would recover or some other power would take its place. Of course, he was not serious about any other power. He named some rather bizarre powers as possibilities, including Brazil. So you can see he wasn't what he really wanted to do. So in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when allegedly American hegemony was real, nobody used the word hegemony. Nobody used the word leadership, which is the word that Charles Kindleberger uses. He only introduces this in this book in early 70s. So that's the retrospective part. But it was also prospective, because making this argument allowed people like him to make the argument that whatever the US was doing around the world, no matter how bad it may seem, it was actually a case in which the United States was providing public goods. Just as a government provides public goods to its people, the United States was providing public goods to the whole world. So it was indeed the world state. This is complete rubbish. And of course, the theory didn't really catch on for a long time. So, he originally stated it in the early 70s into the 80s. Nobody was really necessarily talking about hegemony. In fact, people even wrote books about how the American power was waning. Paul Kennedy wrote his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, in which he was still in the US power was still in its decline. But it was only in the 1990s that people sort of thought, oh, well, the United States is back. There was a big stock market bubble, IT industries were booming and so on. And then, of course, this was succeeded by George Bush, who talked about America being an empire. But that also very soon went pear-shaped. That bubble also burst in the sense that by the middle of the 2000s, you could see that America was bogged down in the quagmire in in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And so, these ideas were already questionable. Then you had 2008. And since that time, people have been talking more and more. Certainly by about the middle of the 2010s, people started talking more and more about multipolarity and such like things. So HST is really essentially dressing up an ambition, a project, and giving it a kind of theoretical disguise, but it is no theory.
One of your most distinctive contributions is what you call the materiality of nations. The idea that nations are not just political fiction but real, economically grounded entities. Why has mainstream international political economy been so resistant to taking nations seriously as economic actors?
The short answer is because it is ruled by a liberal paradigm. The liberal paradigm is the ruling paradigm, and the realist paradigm is there, but as I say, its rationale has always been to justify American American attempts at imperialism, American aggression, and which is also aimed at creating a liberal world economy under its power. So in that sense, that is also kind of realism is underneath everything, a kind of a liberal ideology. So that's the short answer. So why don't they take the materiality of nations seriously? And this kind of liberal idea has become so widespread that even most Marxist scholars accept some or the other version of this liberalism. Either they are in favor of sort of globalization theory or they are in favor of US hegemony theory. But of course, I'm rejecting both. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is that in the process of showing this, I also show that Marx would have agreed with this point, that the only form of development that we have witnessed in the capitalist world has taken place on a distinctly anti-liberal basis. Whether you're talking about the state-led industrialization of countries like Germany or Japan, or you're talking about the socialist countries, which also, people forget, China today captures all the attention because it has become a huge manufacturing power. The other day I was reading that it accounts for roughly 30% of world manufacturing. That's huge. But people forget that the Soviet Union, by the 1930s, had become the second ranking industrial power in the world. And had it not been for this industrial power, the Soviet Union would have never been able to help the Allies win the Second World War. And without the Soviet contribution, the Second World War could not have been won. So, I mean, that's another, how socialism becomes part of the history of capitalism is also interesting. It's a story that I could expand on at some other time. But anyway, so why don't they take? And then finally, a third point, which is that in the larger literature on political economy and international political economy, there is a relatively minority tradition, which is called the developmental state tradition. And what I'm doing is I'm joining them with Marxism, because I show that Marx would have agreed with them about the way industrialization takes place. So in a certain sense, what I'm saying is that, so final point is that the reason why nobody, the international relations theorists don't agree, and even economists don't agree, is that their purpose, they're all ideologies of imperialism. Their purpose is to, there is a very wonderful little book by a guy called Ha-Joon Chang, who is a developmental state theorist. And the title of his book is called Kicking Away the Ladder. So, the idea is that, the first people to climb a ladder, once they get to the top, they kick the ladder away so other people can't climb the same ladder. That ladder is the ladder of economic development, economic development through state-led industrialization. Once the Germans or the Japanese or the Americans climbed up this ladder, they want to kick it away because that way other countries don't develop and they essentially retain their power within the system. They retain their capacity to exploit these other regions and so on. So the truth is that they don't want you to know how to develop, basically.
Professor, you revive the concept of uneven and combined development, originally from Trotsky, and make it to the engine of your entire framework. How does UCD explain why US-led unipolarity was always more an aspiration than a reality?
Right. So, imperialism is very deeply connected with capitalism's contradictions, and I would say it's deeply connected with capitalism's contradictions in three ways. Number one, the imperative of imperialism emerges from capitalism's contradictions. Who is going to buy your excess capital, your excess commodities? How are you going to keep prices stable? All of these are very important problems for capitalist countries, and imperialism helps them solve these questions. Number two, imperialism itself is contradictory because it wants contradictory things from the subordinated periphery. On the one hand, it wants the subordinated periphery to accept its excess commodities and capital. This assumes that the subordinated periphery is sufficiently prosperous to buy these commodities and sufficiently stable to be sites for investment. But on the other hand, it wants the capitalist periphery to supply cheap inputs and cheap labor. That requires that the subordinated periphery be sufficiently poor as to have no choice but to sell its commodities cheaply and to sell its labor cheap. So it's the second way in which the two sets of demands of capitalism from the periphery are contradictory. Thirdly, the moment you have imperialism, it creates a contradictory reality because those powers that are willing and able to resist subordination, which essentially amounts to the denial of development, those powers will resist this and they will industrialize behind protectionist borders. Up to 1914, it was possible for this development to take a capitalist form because there were still stateless territories, weak states that you could dominate, colonize, and otherwise subordinate. After the First World War and after 1914, this path was closed because the imperial powers had divided up the world amongst themselves. So now you had all the development that has taken place since that time is of a completely different character. So this development is different because it has to take place without the luxury of imperialism. It has to take place from a starting point to which that country has been lowered by imperialism. It has to take place in the teeth of imperialist resistance, whether military or financial or technological or whatever. And finally, it has to take place without having the luxury of exporting surplus populations to allegedly empty continents, as Europe did in its time. Yeah. So in all of these ways, they are different. Yes. So essentially, the uneven and combined development is this imperialism and the answering action of anti-imperialism, which is combined development, which is state-led development. And so in this dialectic of imperialism and the opposing force of anti-imperialism, in the long run, despite the power of imperialism, it is the latter which has prevailed. The world has become more and more multipolar since the beginnings of capitalism. And it is through the working out of this domination resistance dialectic that we have seen it occur.
Dr. Radhika, the 2008 financial crisis features prominently in your analysis as a turning point. But over a decade later, the dollar remains the world's reserve currency, and the US remains militarily dominant. His multipolarity has slower to arrive than you anticipated, and what is stalling it?
Right. Now, I would say that yes, the dollar remains a world currency, but its share of, foreign exchange reserves, foreign transactions, etc., it is declining, not by very much, but it is nevertheless declining. Uh, the second thing is that the dollar has been, kept, or this situation has been contrived by more and more Federal Reserve action to try to shore up the value of the dollar and also to shore up the actions, sorry, to shore up the financial activity which is keeping the dollar up. But the Federal Reserve is increasingly, and I've written about this in several places, the Federal Reserve is increasingly coming close to a problem. And this problem has been created by the recent upsurge in inflation. This upsurge in inflation, which, by the way, is part of the anti-imperialism in the sense that this inflation is occurring in part, at least, because China is no longer allowing its goods to be sold for extremely cheap, etc. So, in the 80s and 90s, inflation was low, not because the Federal Reserve was a genius at managing inflation. It was low because third world countries were forced to sell their products for very cheap. This is less and less the case today. Okay, so with the rise of inflation, what's going on is that if the Federal Reserve can only react, will only permit itself to react to inflation, to resolve inflation by raising interest rates. Unfortunately, however, since the beginning of this century, the Federal Reserve has fueled these bubbles in asset markets by a policy of low interest rates. Now, if they were to raise interest rates, in fact, they did start raising interest rates, but the raising of interest rates further in response to inflation will prick the bubble. Indeed, you can say that the bubble has already, some of them have already been pricked. It's an everything bubble. Every asset market is a bubble. So you saw the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and a few other things. We are told that commercial real estate is in a big crisis. The stock market may be booming, but it is only a few magnificent seven shares that are taking it up. And we are told that they are investing in things that are not going to yield the return that is expected. These data farms are not going to do anything. So we are increasingly coming to a crunch point. Okay. So that's the first part. So I would say that there is going to be a big breakdown, okay? And the Federal Reserve will not have the means to deal with it. And even if it did, people will see what's happening and they will no longer trust in the dollar. But unfortunately, and so that's first part. Secondly, unfortunately, despite a lot of talk about de-dollarization, particularly after 2022, when the dollar system was weaponized against Russia, there has not been much advance. My simple explanation is that too many elites in countries like India or Brazil or South Africa, BRICS countries, they are too invested in the dollar system. This is their treasure island. They park their money there. As you know, Indian companies even go abroad to buy up other companies, and so on. They are not investing in India, they're investing abroad. So they are very deeply connected with the dollar system. And so these countries are not eager to de-dollarize. So I suspect that the dollar system will crash well before alternatives to it are created. And then the world will have to scramble to find an alternative.
Professor, critics from the left have often treated globalization as an unstoppable leveling force and empire as a totalizing American project. You argue both are ideological myths. What does the left get dangerously wrong when it accepts those frameworks uncritically?
Well, that's a really important question. So I think that in the case of globalization as well as US empire, this idea that somehow either markets or American management is going to create a world economy which is immeasurably productive and it's going to solve all production problems, and then all we'll have to do as socialists is worry about distribution. This is really wrong. And this is also partly the left is participating in the magical thinking that capitalism works, that capitalism is, the greatest thing for production. But look at the world economy today, even in Western countries. Goods of the necessary quantity and quality are not being produced. Western companies can only produce by employing cheap labor of one form or another, whether in the third world or immigrant labor in their own countries. And so this idea that somehow capitalism constantly increases productivity and production is a pie in the sky idea. Especially in this monopoly phase of capital, it is not capable of doing so. And the left does this. What's dangerous about it is that the left fails to understand that the only way to develop is through a planned strategy of development. But of course, the left does not like planning. Oh, that is too totalitarian, blah, blah, etc. But without planning, we are not going to get. So instead of resorting to this pie in the sky argument, I want everybody on the left to start thinking about how do we make planning, which will be necessary, as democratic as possible, as decentralized as possible. Start thinking about these things, because some kind of planning is going to be absolutely necessary for development. And the other indulgence is that they think that somehow we are going to get to socialism without having to fight for it, without having a party to campaign for it. This is the other problem of the left, is it thinks that, all these nice, cuddly little social movements and NGOs are going to bring us to socialism. No, you're going to need a party. A single party. Again, you can make it as decentralized as you like, you can make it as democratic as you like, but you are not going to take power without a party. Until you create a party that is capable of taking state power, the capitalists will retain state power. So yeah, these are the principal problems that the left is suffering from.
Professor, you bring together class analysis and national perspectives in a single framework, something that has historically been a fault line on the left between internationalist and nationalist. How do you hold those two lenses together without one collapsing into one another?
Could you please repeat that question? Because I didn't catch one word from the first
Sure,
sentence.
sure. You bring together class analysis and national perspectives in a single framework, something that has historically been a fault line on the left between internationalist and nationalist. How do you hold those two lenses together without one collapsing into the other?
This is again a fascinating question, and I would say that Marx did not theorize very much about nations. Whatever theoretical work he did was on class. But when you read some of his works of active political analysis, political economy analysis, whether it is 18th Brumaire or Civil War in France or whatever, you see that nation and state are seamlessly part of it, because basically classes and nations, politics is not about individuals, it's about collective actors. Marx, like classical political economy, understood that classes and nations are both historical actors. That they will act in order to make history. So to me, I think that this is a simple, and in any kind of historical analysis, you have to bring these two together. You can't understand, for example, what any country is doing internationally without understanding what is the ruling class behind it. What does that ruling class want? To what extent, for example, today, one of the ways in which I understand Trump's wars is it has nothing to do, everybody's trying to see some method in Trump's madness. Is he trying to control the world's oil, etc.? Nothing doing. Trump's wars are directly the result of the profound internal crisis of the United States, which has made it very difficult for any of the parties to win power. Trump was able to win power by essentially promising the world to workers, I'm going to make America great again. I'm going to reindustrialize the United States. I'm going to give you blah, blah, etc. And he knows a little over a year into his tenure that his numbers are tanking. His approval ratings are going lower and lower. It is a midterm election year. He needs something he can call success to wave in front of the American electorate. So you see, if you are just looking at the international plane, you will come up with all sorts of bizarre ideas about why Trump is prosecuting these wars. But you have to connect what's happening internationally with what's happening domestically. And of course, international developments also constrain what classes can do domestically. So for these reasons, it is never a complete picture unless both of these agents are analyzed together.
Professor Radhika, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If geopolitical economy as a framework is correct, what does it demand of progressive movements today, particularly in the global south, in terms of
Uh,
strategy, alliances, and economic alternatives to dollar-dominated finance?
Yes. So I would say that, well, dollar dominated finance, I think I've already answered that part of the question because it's crashing and we had better come up with alternatives to it. And I would say that in designing these alternatives, going back to Keynes's proposals for Banco and an international clearing union is a very good start. And I urge everybody to look at it. And one of the reasons why I recommend it is because, as I say, you're not going to get socialism unless you get forms of development within countries which are both productive and egalitarian. And in order to, and the genius of Keynes's proposals was that it left governments free to pursue this kind of development. So that's why the left should urge the adoption of these proposals. So that's the dollar part of it. But the other part of your question was, what is the implication of the left? The implication of the left is that you see the left has I often call it the left's version of neoliberalism. This hatred for the state and having anything to do with the state, with even taking state power, with planning and centralized state planning and so on. I think that you are not going to get to socialism anytime unless you bite this bullet, that you have to grasp this nettle. It's not a comfortable thing to do. A nettle will prick you. It's going to give you some pain, but with you any approach to socialism will begin at the national level. So you have to take national governments seriously. And eventually you will also have to take seriously the idea that there are that actually existing socialism, whether in the past in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe or today in China, it's not perfect. But whoever said that socialism was going to be perfect? The road to socialism is going to be difficult. We are going to make a lot of mistakes. And in order to make as few mistakes as possible, you have to take the experience of actually existing socialisms seriously. You have to understand what went wrong so that you do not repeat that mistake. Bulk of the left today simply dismisses that, saying, oh, we are not going to go that way anyway, so we don't have to know very much about the Soviet Union. China is not really socialist, so we don't have to care about it. In fact, it's even the enemy. And in many parts of the world, people are uncomfortable with the idea that China is socialist. They're uncomfortable with the idea that part of the reason for the legitimacy of the Iranian state even is that there are elements of socialism in the Iranian government today, in the revolutionary Iranian state today. So unless you take these things seriously, unless you see that these countries are not the enemy by or this anti-imperialism that they have, which is, they think that those people who are supporting Iran or Russia or China today are somehow engaging, my enemy's enemy is my friend sort of thing. That is not at all true, and that shouldn't be true. So I think that the left has to take this issue seriously, that there will be on the path to socialism some countries that will have achieved socialism first, which needs, then those countries would need to be supported. Those countries would need to be learned from as you design your own path towards socialism. So these are some of the points that I would underline.
Professor Radhika Desai, thank you for a truly illuminating conversation. Geopolitical economy is not just a book, it is a lens through which we can begin to make sense of a world that mainstream frameworks have consistently failed to explain. From the contradictions of dollar dominance to a deep logic of multipolarity, you have given us both the intellectual tools and the historical perspective to understand the turbulent times we live in. We hope our listeners will pick up this book and continue this exploration. Thank you for being with us today and thank you for your time.
Thank you for your very excellent interview, Deepak. I really enjoyed it. I think you
Thank
got to some very key, all the key elements of the book. So thank you very much.
thank you.